This is the image that Vladimir Putin spent months of preparation and millions of rubles trying to prevent the world from seeing. A thick column of black smoke rising over St. Petersburg, curling into the morning sky directly behind a banner that reads, St. Petersburg International Economic Forum 2026, Putin's showcase event for projecting economic power, his answer to Davos, his annual statement to the world that Russia is open for business, stable, and winning. And Ukraine burned it, not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. The oil terminal in Putin's own hometown, the city where he was born, the city that represents his identity and his legacy, was on fire. And across the harbor at the Kronstadt naval base, a Russian guided missile corvette sat in dry dock with drone strike damage running through its hull. The forum guests had barely finished checking in when the smoke started rising. Some of them received recommendations to adjust their visit programs that morning. The backdrop of Russia's most important prestige event in 2026 was not foreign investment, not economic partnership, not the image of a powerful nation projecting confidence. It was fire. And Ukraine put it there with purpose, with precision, and with timing so perfect it could not possibly have been an accident. Stay with me. Because what happened in St. Petersburg on June 3, 2026, is not just a military strike. It is a strategic statement delivered to the entire world at exactly the moment when Putin most needed the world to believe the opposite. And to understand why that statement lands with the weight it does, you need to understand what SPIEF is, what it was supposed to do this year, what Ukraine did to it, and what Russia's response reveals about the real state of this war. This is Tuesday, June 2nd through Wednesday, June 3rd, 2026. 48 hours that need to be understood together because they form a sequence that tells you everything about where this war is heading. Here is what happens first. On the night of June 2nd, Russia launches one of the largest aerial attacks of the entire four-year war. The numbers are not ambiguous. 656 attack drones, 73 missiles of various types, including hypersonic Zircon anti-ship missiles, fired in 2 waves of 4. The main targets are Kyiv, Dnipro, Kharkiv, Zaporizhzhia, Poltava. Ukraine's Air Force intercepts or suppresses 602 of the 656 drones and 40 of the 73 missiles, which is a success rate that sounds impressive until you count what gets through. In Dnipro, 16 people are killed. 2 of them are children. A 4-story apartment building collapses. 7 residential buildings are practically completely destroyed. 49 additional residential buildings are damaged. In Kyiv, 6 more people die and more than 90 are injured. The attack cuts electricity to 140,000 residents of the capital. At street level, Kyiv residents who had been sheltering in metro stations and bunkers for hours emerged to find collapsed buildings, burning car dealerships, and rescue crews digging through rubble for survivors. One resident, standing in front of her destroyed apartment building with her 6-year-old daughter, tells a Reuters correspondent that she could not understand what was happening. She describes it as an apocalypse. Everything was covered with debris, she says. Everything in smoke. You could see nothing. This is what Russia sends at civilian cities on the eve of its own flagship economic forum, designed to attract foreign investment by demonstrating stability and prosperity. Russia's defense ministry, with the kind of institutional disconnect that can only function in a system that punishes honesty, issues a statement claiming the assault targeted military industrial, fuel, and transport facilities and military bases. Satellite imagery and first responder footage shows collapsed apartment blocks, shattered residential neighborhoods, and rescue crews operating in rubble. The Russian Defense Ministry calls these military targets. The rest of the world calls them home. Zelensky's response to the attack is precise and public. He says it, out loud, on record. Ukraine is not protected from ballistic missiles and other missile strikes. If that protection does not arrive, these attacks will continue. He calls for more American Patriot missiles. He calls for Europe to build its own anti-ballistic defense. And then, while Russia was still counting bodies and filing reports about the success of its precision strikes against military infrastructure, Ukraine got to work. Now, here's the part that every major Western outlet reported, but almost none of them fully explained in terms of what it actually means for the trajectory of this war. On the night of June 2nd to 3rd, hours after Russia's 656 drone barrage, Ukraine's unmanned systems forces and the Security Service of Ukraine launched a coordinated long-range drone operation against the St. Petersburg region. The primary target was the St. Petersburg Oil Terminal, one of the largest oil transshipment complexes in all of northwestern Russia, a facility that the Ukrainian Armed Forces General Staff describes as playing a crucial role in Russian fuel exports and logistics. The drones flew over 1,100 kilometers from Ukrainian territory. They hit the terminal. At least 4 separate large fire sites were recorded at the facility. The oil terminal, which handles a massive portion of Russia's Baltic Sea energy exports, was burning. Simultaneously, Ukraine hit Kronstadt, the Velishchinsky dry dock at the Kronstadt naval base. The target was the Boikiy, a Russian Baltic Fleet guided missile corvette. Project 20380 class, launched 2011, in service since 2013, and in the dry dock since February 2026 for scheduled repairs. The Boikiy was not a random target. Ukraine's drone force commander Robert Brovdy, known as Magyar, explains exactly why this ship was chosen. The Boikiy had a colorful record of voyages and operations along NATO borders. It had been used by Russia to escort vessels in the Shadow Oil Fleet, the network of tankers Russia uses to move sanctioned crude past international monitoring systems and deliver oil revenue to a Kremlin that needs that revenue to keep paying for the war. At 0635 local time, Ukrainian drones hit the Boikiy at least twice midships, just aft the superstructure. Satellite imagery released hours later shows smoke rising from the warship in dry dock. The footage released by Ukraine's drone forces shows the strikes connecting. The ship that escorted Russia's Shadow Fleet was burning in the city where Putin was born. There were 4 fire sites at the St. Petersburg Oil Terminal. There were hits on a warship at the Kronstadt naval base, and 3 districts of St. Petersburg itself were struck, with infrastructure objects hit in the Kirovsky and Krasnoselsky areas. Russia's air defenses shot down 59 drones in the Leningrad region that night, according to the governor's statement. 59 drones intercepted, and the terminal still burned, and the corvette still burned. And when the sun came up over St. Petersburg on the morning of June 3, 2026, heavy black smoke hung over the city's harbor, visible from the historic city center, and it hung there as the first forum delegates arrived. This is what you need to understand about the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, because it is the context that transforms a military strike into a political detonation. SPIEF is not a trade conference. SPIEF is a performance. It is Putin's annual production, held every year in the city of his birth, designed to demonstrate to the global business community that Russia is a reliable partner, an investment destination, and a country that functions normally despite whatever the West says about it. Before 2022, it attracted genuine Western corporate leadership. The number of Western participants has progressively declined since Russia seized Crimea in 2014, collapsed further after the full-scale invasion in 2022, and this year the guest list tells you everything about where Russia now stands in the eyes of the world's serious economic players. The most prominent American guests at SPIEF 2026 are Steven Seagal, who has held Russian citizenship since 2016 and has been a vocal supporter of Putin, Candace Owens, a conservative American podcaster attending a panel on family values, and Rodney Mims Cook Jr., the chairman of the United States Commission of Fine Arts, who is the first American official to attend SPIEF since 2017 and whose presence the Kremlin touted as evidence of a diplomatic thaw. Also reported to be in Russia for the occasion were Andrew Tate and his brother Tristan, who were welcomed at a Moscow airport with traditional Russian dancing and an offering of bread and salt. This is the delegation that now represents the Western face of Putin's Showcase Economic Forum, an action film actor who has not made a relevant movie in decades, a podcaster, a government official whose normal portfolio involves approving public art and architecture. This is the face of Russia's international economic legitimacy in 2026, and the Kremlin presented it with pride. At the same time, Saudi Arabia was the guest of honor. Saudi Energy Minister Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman was due to participate in the plenary session with Putin on Friday. Chinese Vice President Han Zheng arrived with a large delegation. The message Russia wanted to send to the world was unmistakable. The West has abandoned us, but the East has not. Saudi Arabia is here. China is here. We are not isolated. We are simply reoriented. That was the image Putin needed SPIEF to project. That was the story the Kremlin had spent months building toward, and then the smoke rose over the harbor. Reuters photographers, positioned in central St. Petersburg to cover the opening of the forum, found themselves photographing something that the Kremlin's communications team had no prepared response for: the St. Petersburg Economic Forum branding and banners framed against a curtain of black smoke from the oil terminal fire. The image was not staged by Ukraine, it was staged by geography. The terminal is that close to the city center. The smoke was that visible, and the photographs of that juxtaposition, forum branding behind a wall of black smoke rising from a burning Russian oil facility, circulated across every major international news outlet within hours. Putin's goddaughter, Ksenia Sobchak, whose social media post about the grief of the Ukraine war made headlines weeks earlier, published video of forum guests arriving in St. Petersburg against the backdrop of thick smoke from the fire. Ukraine's drone force commander Magyar was simultaneously posting footage of the Boikiy strikes to Telegram, with the message that they had hunted down and set ablaze a guided missile weapons carrier. He added that they had wanted to arrange a tour for guests on the cruiser Moskva, but since the Moskva was resting at the bottom of the Black Sea, they had to take out 2 other ships at the venue instead. The dark humor of that message is the point. Ukraine understood what SPIEF represented to Putin. Ukraine understood the timing. Ukraine understood that striking St. Petersburg on the morning of the forum's opening, with the world's press already in position to document it, was not merely a military operation. It was a communication addressed directly to every businessman, every diplomat, every foreign delegation arriving that morning to hear Putin's vision of Russia's future. The communication said there is no safe distance, there is no protected city, there is no stable rear area where you can invest your money and not worry about what happens next. Nowhere inside Russia, at any distance, is beyond what Ukraine can reach. Here is the technical detail that makes this point more devastating than it initially appears. The drones that struck the St. Petersburg Oil Terminal and the Kronstadt naval base flew over 1,100 kilometers from Ukrainian territory. This is not a short-range attack. This is not a border strike. The distance from the Ukrainian border to St. Petersburg is roughly equivalent to the distance from Paris to Berlin, or from Washington to Chicago. Ukraine's drones flew that distance, at low altitude, evading Russian air defenses along the entire route, and arrived at one of the most strategically and symbolically significant cities in Russia at the exact moment when the maximum number of international witnesses were present to see what happens when they get there. And it is not the first time Ukraine has reached this far. In April 2026, Ukraine struck the Chagall airfield in Chelyabinsk at a distance of 1,700 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. The pattern is consistent and accelerating. Ukraine has been systematically extending the operational range of its unmanned systems, pushing deeper into Russia, targeting the economic infrastructure that generates the revenue keeping the Kremlin's war machine operational. The oil terminals at Ust-Luga and Primorsk on the Baltic have been struck repeatedly since the end of March 2026. The St. Petersburg Oil Terminal hit on June 3rd is part of a deliberate campaign to destroy the facilities through which Russia exports the crude oil that keeps its war budget funded. Russia launched a record 8,150 long-range drones at Ukraine in May 2026 alone, a 24% increase from April. Ukraine intercepted approximately 90% of them. And while Russia was launching those 8,150 drones at Ukrainian cities, Ukraine was systematically hitting the oil infrastructure that pays for every single one of them. The Kremlin frames its drone campaigns as strikes against Ukrainian military-industrial targets. Ukraine frames its strikes as strikes against Russian war financing. The difference is not just rhetorical. The Russian Defense Ministry's statistics show drones launched and drones intercepted. Ukraine's results show terminals burning and corvettes smoking in dry dock. The Kremlin's response to the June 3rd strikes was delivered by spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, who told state media that Russia would keep striking Ukraine systematically in response to such attacks, describing Moscow's approach as a new paradigm in the conflict. That is the word the Kremlin chose, paradigm, as if Russia had chosen this escalation deliberately as a strategy rather than responding to a situation it cannot control and cannot reverse. The governor of St. Petersburg, Alexander Beglov, released a statement confirming that unspecified infrastructure objects had been attacked in 3 districts of the city, that several facilities had been damaged, that cleanup operations were underway, and that there had been no fatalities. He mentioned injuries but provided no details about the oil terminal itself. He did not comment on the fires. He did not explain to his city's 5 million residents why a Ukrainian drone campaign could penetrate that deep, why the air defenses that shot down 59 drones still could not protect the terminal, and why the corvette in the Kronstadt dry dock was burning on the same morning that Putin's economic forum was welcoming foreign investment with branding banners and welcome receptions. The mobile internet services in St. Petersburg were cut during the attack. Airport flights were disrupted. Nearly 30 flights were delayed by over 2 hours. 9 flights were diverted to other airfields. The forum's organizers had hoped to demonstrate stability and attractiveness to foreign investors. They got drone-disrupted airspace, cut mobile services, and photographs that circulated globally, showing their branding against a background of industrial fire. There is a deeper strategic logic at work here that the headline coverage misses, and it is the logic that explains why this moment is more significant than it appears to people who are only tracking battlefield positions and frontline kilometers. Russia's ability to sustain this war financially depends on oil revenue. Before the war began, Russia's economy was heavily dependent on hydrocarbon exports. Western sanctions have reduced Russia's access to Western markets, but Russia rerouted much of its oil through Asia, particularly to China and India, using the shadow fleet that the Boikiy corvette was helping to escort. The Baltic Sea terminals, including the one Ukraine struck on June 3rd, handle a massive share of Russia's seaborne crude exports. The Ust-Luga and Primorsk facilities, which Ukraine has been striking repeatedly since March 2026, handle roughly 2/5 of Russia's seaborne oil exports according to International Energy Agency data. When those terminals burn, when those export facilities are damaged or destroyed, the oil sitting in the pipelines behind them has nowhere to go. Russia loses revenue that was being used to pay for the 656 drones that hit Kyiv and Dnipro on June 2nd. Ukraine is not simply responding to Russian attacks. Ukraine is severing the financial artery that makes those attacks possible. Every oil terminal burned is a reduction in the funding available for the next wave of missiles. Every shadow fleet escort vessel disabled means more oil sitting in storage rather than generating the dollars and yuan that flow back into Kremlin military spending. The strategic logic is precise, and it is working. And the timing on June 3rd was not coincidental. Ukraine chose to execute this particular strike, at this particular scale, at this particular moment, with the entire international press corps already in St. Petersburg, to cover an economic forum that Putin had designed to project strength and stability. The message delivered was not just military. It was addressed to every CEO, every energy minister, every foreign delegation sitting in that forum hall. You are inside a country that cannot protect its own second city. You are inside a country whose oil infrastructure burns while its president hosts economic forums to discuss investment. You are inside a country where the gap between the official narrative and the ground reality has become impossible to manage. Zelensky confirmed the strikes on social media with characteristic economy of words. He noted that important facilities on Russian territory had been hit, including the St. Petersburg Oil Terminal, located 1,100 kilometers from Ukraine's border. He said Ukraine aimed only at legitimate targets related to Russia's war effort, and he indicated that Kyiv plans to escalate its long-range drone attacks further, not maintain, escalate. This matters because it closes the loop on what the previous 48 hours actually mean when viewed as a sequence. Russia escalates to 656 drones and 73 missiles hitting Ukrainian cities, including hypersonic zircons, killing at least 22 people, collapsing apartment buildings, sending residents into metro shelters for hours. Ukraine responds by burning an oil terminal in Putin's hometown on the opening day of his prestige economic forum, disabling a guided missile corvette at the Baltic Fleet's principal base and promising that what comes next will be larger. This is not an exchange that Russia is winning. This is an exchange in which Russia is spending enormous resources, hardware, and international reputation to kill Ukrainian civilians, and Ukraine is spending smaller but increasingly precise resources to destroy the economic infrastructure that funds the Russian war machine. The calculus is not symmetric. The returns are not comparable. And there is one more layer that almost no analysis is fully grappling with. What happened to Russia's Victory Day parade weeks before SPIEF had already established the pattern. Putin reduced the scale of his annual Victory Day parade in Moscow because he was afraid of Ukrainian drone attacks. The man who rebuilt his entire political identity around projecting military strength reduced his own most important symbolic military event because he could not guarantee the skies above Red Square. He held a smaller parade in a city he could not fully secure, and then he held an economic forum in his hometown, which Ukraine burned. These are not isolated incidents. They are a progression. The progression is away from the image Putin has spent 25 years constructing and toward the reality that has been accumulating beneath it. The world watched the forum branding against the smoke. The Saudi energy minister saw it. The Chinese vice president's delegation saw it. Every business leader, every diplomat, every journalist sitting in those forum halls knew that the city outside was under drone attack and that Russia's air defenses had been unable to prevent it. Some of them received instructions to adjust their schedules. All of them understood what was happening and what it meant. The forum went forward because canceling it would have been an even larger admission of the situation than holding it under a cloud of smoke. But holding it under a cloud of smoke is its own statement. You cannot frame that image as stability. Zelensky sent a message of his own through an open letter to Putin just days after the strikes, proposing direct peace talks. But the letter's context made it something other than a simple diplomatic overture. It came from a position of demonstrated capability, not weakness. Ukraine can reach St. Petersburg. Ukraine can reach Kronstadt. Ukraine can reach Chelyabinsk at 1,700 kilometers. The peace proposal did not arrive from a country that needs the war to end. It arrived from a country that demonstrated it can make the war progressively more expensive, more destructive, and more embarrassing for Russia with every week that passes. Putin rejected the proposal, insisting on territorial concessions and the surrender of Donetsk region before any ceasefire could take place. But the rejection now sits in a different context than it would have before June 3rd. Putin is rejecting talks from inside a city that just watched its oil terminal burn on the opening day of his economic forum. The images from St. Petersburg are already in the historical record. They cannot be edited. The photographs of forum branding against black smoke, of a burning corvette in dry dock, of Kremlin officials and invited guests receiving instructions to adjust their programs because of drone activity, those images will be analyzed and referenced for years, because what they document is something that was supposed to be impossible. The permanent rear area, the impenetrable homeland, the safe city where power is projected outward rather than where vulnerability is exposed inward, all of that has been revised. Ukraine did not conquer St. Petersburg. Ukraine did something more strategically significant. Ukraine made it impossible for anyone present in St. Petersburg that morning to ignore what the war actually looks like from inside Russia. Not the managed narrative, not the state television version, not the carefully constructed SPIEF branding. The actual war reaching into Putin's own city on Putin's own prestige day with fire visible from the forum halls. Watch what happens in the coming weeks with this framework in mind. Every barrel of oil that cannot be exported from a damaged Baltic terminal is revenue that does not reach the Kremlin's war budget. Every Shadow Fleet escort vessel sitting disabled in dry dock is a gap in the logistics network Russia depends on to move sanctioned crude past international sanctions enforcement. And every Ukrainian drone that reaches deeper into Russian territory establishes a new operational baseline that the next wave of drones will extend further. Russia fired 656 drones at Ukrainian cities on June 2nd. Ukraine responded by burning Putin's oil terminal on June 3rd. The Kremlin called its approach a new paradigm. Ukraine called it fair. And everyone who was watching the smoke rise over the St. Petersburg Economic Forum branding that morning understood, regardless of which side they were on, that the war had just said something that no press release from either government could unsay. Subscribe to Global Power Vision right now and hit that notification bell, because in the coming days, Zelensky's direct challenge to Putin and Russia's response to it will tell you everything about which direction this war is moving. We will be here breaking down every development as it happens. The images from June 3rd will be remembered as the moment the war arrived in Putin's living room and burned in front of his guests. The only question left is what he does next, and whether what he does next changes anything at all about the trajectory that is already running beneath every statement he makes from a city that still smells of smoke.